So it's a story about an older couple that go into a fast food restaurant to eat together. I don't know what franchise, but they went in and they ordered one hamburger, one order of fries, and one soft drink, one soda. And they sat down at the table, and the husband, the older man, cut the hamburger precisely in half and put half in front of his wife. Then he took the fries and put on a napkin, and he distributed them exactly in half. So she had half the fries, he had half the fries. He took the soda, put the straw in, took a sip, and put it in the middle of the table. And other people watching, this all take place, and they noticed how the man started to eat first. He was eating the hamburger and taking bites, and then he was eating the fries. And occasionally the older woman would grab the soda and take a sip, but she just sat there. And so people around started to be a little bothered by this scene. They felt bad for this couple, and they just assumed, they just couldn't afford anything else. And so a younger gentleman walked up to their table and said, excuse me, but I'm watching this. I have the money. I can buy you another meal. And the gentleman said, no. The older man said, no, we share everything. And so the younger man left, sat back down, and they continued to watch. And again, they were bothered as they watched how the man sat there eating every bite, and the woman, the wife, just sat there watching him. And occasionally taking a sip of the soda, that's it. So finally the man finished everything, and again the young man came over to the table and said, listen, it's no problem. I can buy you another meal. It's nothing. And she said, no. The woman did this and said, no, we share everything. And so he sat back down, but he noticed, everyone in the restaurant noticed that the older woman just sat there. She wasn't eating. Half the burger and the fries were sitting in front of her. And she just sat there, and the guy was cleaning off his mouth and sitting there for a minute. And then that was it. Finally, someone said, well, when are you going to eat? And she said, whenever he shares the teeth. They said they share everything. So you can tell Mom that her story, her joke was told today. And when you all see her again, you can ridicule her for that. Please, not me. But this morning, in the time we have together, undoubtedly for those of us who have sat in sanctuaries before with our ears turned on and tuned in, or perhaps for those who've sat in Sunday school classrooms, or any of the adult disciples here who peruse our sacred scriptures, have come across the name of the one called Lazarus. Now, normally 9 out of 10 people, if not even 10 out of 10 people, when you ask them to tell them who Lazarus is in the Bible, they undoubtedly would tell you about the brother of Mary and Martha, right? The brother who succumbed to an instant attack, and within a matter of moments, it seems from the story, was in a 7-foot pine box. And Jesus shows up days later, and he goes to the tomb of Lazarus, and he calls out from beyond the line of life and death for Lazarus, come out. And indeed, Lazarus comes out, the Lazarus who's liberated from death. That's the Lazarus that most of us are familiar with, that many will know when you speak of Lazarus from the scriptures. But yet often, the Lazarus that's easily and often forgotten is the one who isn't liberated out of death, but the one who is languishing in life. The Lazarus who was read a moment ago by Ms. Carla from Luke's gospel. And that's what I want us just to take today to make sure we know what this story is for us and the reasons behind Jesus telling it, and how do we then wrestle with, how do we live with this teaching that Jesus gives to us today. In some sense, I want to continue pushing us from what we talked about 2 weeks ago. In many ways, Jesus is once again doing a recalibration, that Jesus is once again challenging the church leaders and folks of the day about how they speak of God's will and God's way. Remember, 2 weeks ago, we talked about how often we connect human suffering to divine punishment, right? You all remember that? With the tower that fell and Pilate who killed. And Jesus said, no, that's not it. Well, in the same sense, now in this story, Jesus does another recalibration and understanding. He, in essence, pulls back the veil for us to understand the reality of wealth and poverty, to understand about God's blessings and the like. And so I hope we don't miss that today in this story. Lazarus and the rich man is a parable, okay? So just touch your neighbor and tell them it's a story. All right, it's a story. It's a parable. A parable is, as I was taught many years ago, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. In other words, Jesus tells parables so we can relate to their reality, but behind that story is a glimpse of heaven, is understanding of God's will and God's way for us. And so Jesus tells this story of the rich man and Lazarus as a parable, as just that, a story. Perhaps Jesus witnessed this type of event taking place in his own life, where we witness often. Perhaps he actually knew somebody named Lazarus who would sit by a gate and beg. But we have to say today from the beginning that the names, characters, places, events, and incidents are used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. You heard that before? It's a story. But let's look at this story and this parable for this moment, and let's also begin to understand just when does Jesus give us this teaching? When does he pull this story out and place it for our hearing as well? In fact, what he does is, go down please a slide for me, Andrea. If you go back just a few verses in Luke chapter 16, Jesus had just taught that no worker can serve two bosses. He'll either hate the first and love the second, or adore the first and despise the second. Jesus went on to say, you cannot serve both God and money. Now, the Pharisees, or the church leaders, a money-obsessed bunch, we're told, in the gospel, heard Jesus say these things. They rolled their eyes, dismissing him as hopelessly out of touch. So Jesus spoke to them. You are masters at making yourselves look good in front of others, but God knows what's behind the appearance. What society sees and calls monumental, God sees through and calls monstrous. That's what Jesus said, and he's speaking again to us. He's speaking to those in church. He's speaking to especially the leaders, those who they would call Pharisees. That's the context in which it's being told. He's telling it to those who were already righteous, if you would. Speaking of those who interpreted Scripture, who preached Scripture, who taught Bible study, he's talking to them in this moment, which again is challenging because, we as church folks, and especially, as pastors, we love to be seen. And we love to dress up. And we love to drive the fancy cars. And we love, you know how it is. We love to have an all eyes on me mentality. Y'all with me? Which is not new. It's pervaded faith movements all along. And that's what Jesus is now talking to and standing to. And so Jesus has now this invitation. See, he's looking at those who have the law of God in their heads, but they lack love and compassion in their hearts. Where we are as disciples called to have a synthesis of mind and heart, mind, body, and soul. Where we are, as followers of Jesus, we're called to believe with our mind, but then behave in that way with our heart. Y'all with me? You got it? We are to believe with our mind, but then behave in that way with our heart. In other words, there has to be a connection between our beliefs and our behavior. We can go back and forth. Psychologists are not sure. Do beliefs shape behaviors, or do behaviors shape beliefs? Let's just say you need both. And so Jesus, again, is trying to get those in the church at that time to understand just what it is that God calls us to do and how we're called to live. And so he tells them this story where there's two characters, two people. For one, it's the best of times. For the other, it's the worst of times. And the gulf between them, the divide, is so great that is often not even seen. So let's just look. Jesus is masterful. Look what he does. Go down the slide, please. In just 3 verses, Jesus lays the whole story out. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. That's all we know about the one. Then the second, and at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. So we have these two people. The one, we're told, was a rich man, living at the top of the food chain, the top of the pyramid, behind a fortified gate, whose societal value is physically symbolized. His value is demonstrated in what is on him. He's dressed in what? Fine linen and purple, right? You see that? Purple and fine linen, which purple was a sign of royalty and wealth in those days. So he is also, we're told, that his belly is filled from sumptuous dining, right? So you have the one, the rich man, who again is attired in fine linen and lavish, wealthy, powerful purple clothing. Meanwhile, on the outside of the gate is who? Or on the other side of the tracks is who? A poor man, down and out, whose societal value also is reflected in the fact that we're not even told what he's wearing, except for the fact that his skin wears sores, which perhaps the only sign of purple upon Lazarus' body is the bruises and lesions that have come from the torment that he's in and where he is in life. And what's amazing, again, if you look at this, the only relief that Lazarus has is from some compassionate canines who come by to soothe his suffering by licking what? The sores. I again am reminded of a Mark Twain quote that said, "Heaven goes by favor. Because it went by merit, you would stay out and your dog would get in." How often dogs demonstrate more compassion than those of us made in the image of God. Anyone here that has a dog knows what I'm talking about. And so here we have these two realities. But what I want us just to see for sure, I hope you don't miss, that is so powerful that Jesus does, is if you look, we're told that there was a rich man, right, who was dressed in purple and fine linen. That's all we're told, a rich man. But look about the next man. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus. Do you notice the rich man has no name? In this story, Jesus does not name the rich man. He intentionally names the poor man. Why is that so important? It's important because there's so much power in a name. There's so much power in naming. In fact, it's one of the things that we often don't realize that we have. I mean, you got to be careful about the names you call other people, especially what you call your children, because names have power to them. We used to have a saying when I was a kid, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." What a lie that is. That is a lie. Because think about what names do. You know, names can either hurt or they can heal. Names could have a barb to them that cause more suffering, or names can have a balm to them, which bring about healing. But names have power behind them. Names mean so much to us. The power to name is so incredible to have. That power to name or name someone. That's why in the book Roots, why Kunte Kinte was so clear, I've got a name. The name I was given at my birth will be my name, not the name this slave master's trying to give me, because names have power. As our children get older, I know there's music that is out there that we are not going to have them listen to in our presence because of the names they call people, especially names they call women and females or other men. That is not a name that is going to be heard in my presence or spoken, because names have power to them. And the power to name is an incredible power God gives. In fact, God gave that power to Adam. You go and name all the living creatures. And how do we name? Who has the power to be able to name whose marriage is legitimate or legal or not? Who has the power to name about who gets to stay or go? Who gets the power to name? I remember what's happening in our country with this opiate crisis. The rise in heroin is also directly linked to the amount of opiates being prescribed by doctors. I shared just last year when I was in the hospital, I hit my call button. I told the nurse, I have a headache. They were trying to bring me Oxycontin for a headache. I just need some Tylenol. Tylenol codeine? No, Tylenol. But why are they so quick to prescribe these things that someone else has named as needed? It's that power to name. If you think names don't have power, just catch the name felon and watch what happens to your rights. What happens to you finding employment and everything else. Names have power, and we know the names. What's that old show with Robin Leach, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous? We know the names. The names, the old money, Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and Carnegie and Ford. We know the names, and the names of Gates and the name of Jobs and the name of Zuckerberg and the name of Oprah and the name of Kardashian and the name of Trump. Because people with power, we know their names. People magazine. What people are in People magazine? Not you and me. Because it's the names. But what's amazing, I don't want you to miss today, it's so important and pivotal that what Jesus does here is he challenges that by saying, I'm going to let you know I know the name of this one. I know the name of the one who's at the gate, that nobody else knows his name. His name is Lazarus. By the way, the name Lazarus means God has helped. Really? We'll get back to that. He names him Lazarus, God has helped. So what happens, and this is another thing to look at. See, both, the one thing that Lazarus and the rich man, they both what? Die. They both die. I mean, Dr. King, when he spoke at the funeral services for little girls killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, Dr. King said these eloquent words: death comes to every individual. There is an amazing democracy about death. It is not aristocracy for some of the people, but a democracy for all the people. Kings die and beggars die. Rich men and poor men die. Old people die and young people die. Death comes to the innocent and it comes to the guilty. Death is an irreducible common denominator of all people. And so both die. And what happens? What happens? Lazarus, we're told, is what? It says the angels came and took Lazarus, and they took him to the bosom of Abraham. Abraham, the father of faith, right? And the rich man dies, and you know what it says? He died and was buried, period. That's it. Buried, period. And then, of course, we're told that Abraham, again, is in Abraham's bosom. And where's the rich man go? Hades, right? But just hang out for a minute. Nowhere does it say in this story about heaven and hell. Just know that. It's not heaven and hell. It's a place. Lazarus goes to a place in Abraham's bosom, which is the presence of God. The rich man goes to Hades, which is the same thing in Hebrew, Sheol, which is the place of the dead, where God is not, if you would. And so this is not to somehow place a judgment, which has to be said today. In fact, really, this story is not so much about the afterlife. It was really trying to mirror this life. Because one thing we cannot do is we cannot use this story to simply say all rich people are going to. That's not the point. It's not that all rich people are going to hell. That's not the point. And it's also not to glorify poverty. It's not to tell poor people, oh, I know it's rough in this life, but don't worry. You'll get your reward after you die. What is that? And how often has that been used, again, to pacify people who are looking for food, right, and sustenance in their life? It's not about that. We miss the point when we get bogged down in that understanding. What it is, though, a point is to understand this. It is a point to understand that the difficulty for the rich man and what we see that Jesus shared is it wasn't that the rich man had riches, but the riches had the rich man. It wasn't that he had wealth, but his wealth had him. That's what controlled him. That was what his own center of love was. That's what all went to for him. He hoarded. He kept to his own. He had no concern for anybody else but himself. That's all. He never saw beyond the gate to see what else was out there. All he saw was what I could get for me and for mine. And it's kind of ironic because we also can tell from this story that Jesus tells that he knew the man's name. He knew Lazarus' name because when he sees Lazarus with Abraham, he says, tell Lazarus. So all along he knew his name at the gate. He knew his name right there, laying there. And it even says how Lazarus would love to eat the scraps. It never says he actually ate the scraps from his table. And it's also amazing to me where the rich man says, let him dip his finger. That's all I'm asking for. I'm asking for a drop of water. Let him dip his finger in the water that he can soothe the torment I have here in Hades. But what the irony then is what is being said to the rich man is you want Lazarus to dip his finger in water for you, but you wouldn't lift the finger to help him when he was in need. But again, the story isn't so much, again, about the afterlife. It's about this life right now. It's about you and me. And what is it that, for us, that we do for the sake of others? What do we do when we see those suffering in agony and in pain to alleviate that suffering? Two things I just want to leave with, and I'll take my seat, is just for you to hold on to today. Is one thing that may need to happen, again, going back to this recalibration that Jesus gives, is perhaps we need to rethink what it means to be blessed. Rethink what it means to be blessed. Because I fall in the same line of thinking you do, that when I get a new car, which we bought, it's used, but it's new to me. We bought a newer car, and people, oh, aren't you blessed, right? And I can fall, oh, look at my blessing. Look, I got blessed. Or you get a new suit. Look at my blessing. Or a house. Look at my blessing. And so often what we call blessing are the material things that we get, as if God has gone to get it for us. God is a cosmic bellhop who goes to fetch what you want and bring it back to you and able to say, look at how blessed I am. We often, in a consumer-driven society, call our blessings and what we get. But consider this morning. There are hundreds of millions of Christians in this world who live on less than $1 a day. Are they blessed? See, if we limit it to these things we get materially, we have to look at what that blessing is. What Jesus has done, that I hope we see today, and doesn't just do it here, but does it over and over again. What Jesus tries to show us is the blessing is not in the receiving end. The blessing is in the giving. The blessing is not in what I can accumulate. The blessing is in what I can share. Although please don't share your teeth. Are y'all with me? See, what if we looked at things differently? What if we looked at what I get is the burden and what I give is the blessing? What if we calibrate our understanding of what it is to receive and what it is to give? Studies have shown, in fact, there was a study done at the University of Buffalo a few years back that showed that generous people tend to live longer and healthier lives. And I believe that's a connection to showing about how that's the Spirit of God working through us as we are generous and giving of ourselves. How do you feel after you've helped somebody else? What happens to your feeling when you give to somebody else? When you've been used by God in a way to give that blessing, to be that blessing, what does that do for you? I mean, it's an amazing feeling to have in that moment of what we can do for somebody else. And so really throughout Jesus' ministry, he was showing how blessing is in serving, not being served. Blessing is in giving and not simply getting. And the second thing I believe for us today to do carefully is recalibrate how we talk about the poor and disadvantaged. How we look at and how we talk about and how we treat. How we see those who have less than us and what we say about them. Going back to the whole naming thing, you know, when you meet someone who is out on the streets, you may assume you know their story. But you don't know their story till you sit down and hear their story. And it's amazing often the stories of what led them to where they are at that place. And often then you realize that, boy, I'm just a few steps from that same place in life. Of how we talk about those who suffer from disadvantage in life. Of those who are separated from resources, and often communities of poverty are those that are even more isolated. John Powell, who's a professor at Ohio State, says that we all suffer. Everybody suffers. Everybody struggles. Everybody has hard times. But somewhere along the way, we have to acknowledge there are those who have surplus suffering. Those who have an overflow of suffering based upon their zip code or based upon where they live and what they endure day in and day out. And what are we to do then as followers of Jesus to alleviate that suffering, that call that we're made to have to serve those who have less than us? We have to recalibrate. We have to look at people and treat them with the dignity and respect that all God's children deserve. I want to close with a story here that took place in 258 A.D. It's about 200 years after Jesus rose from the dead. It was Emperor Valerian, who was the Roman emperor at the time, and he issued an anti-Christian decree. And his decree was that all the Christians would be killed, and they rounded up those who were called deacons, and they had already killed 4 of them, and there was one deacon who remained whose name was Lawrence. And so finally they got Lawrence to come in. They found out Lawrence was the chief deacon who held the money, and he served the poor and those who were hungry more than anybody else. And so Emperor said to Lawrence that I want the church's treasures. If you give me the church's treasures, I will let you live. And so Lawrence promised him, I will come back with the church's treasures. And Lawrence went out into the streets, and he rounded up all the men and women he could find who had been left living in the streets. And he found children, he found the elderly, and he brought those who had been disabled, and he assembled a whole giant group of people. And with them, he walked back into the emperor's palace, and he stood before Emperor Valerian, and he said, here, these are the true treasures of the church. And of course, the emperor was convinced that he was hiding the treasures, and he ordered him executed as well. But again, we need to recalibrate and look again at all those around us and see one another as our common humanity and treat with dignity, because Lazarus is still at the gate, and Lazarus is still in need of service and to be alleviated from his suffering. Are we just going to step by, or are we going to step up and serve all those who are in need? Amen. Let's give God a hand clap of praise.